No state has done more for voting rights and voting access this year than Virginia, and the leadership role on those reforms was played by women. Hi, I'm Hedrick Smith, longtime New York Times correspondent and former Washington bureau chief and creator of investigative documentaries for PBS and Frontline. Go back half a dozen years and the Virginia state government looks very deep South and deep red. It was run by Republicans and managed by men. Democrats were totally outgunned, and there weren't very many women, only 24 women out of 140 state lawmakers in the two houses. But that old, comfortable boys' club in Richmond was in for a big shock. The last two state elections have totally flipped that situation upside down. The first big blue wave came in 2017, mainly in the northern Virginia suburbs across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. Democrats flipped 15 Republican seats that year, and 11 of the winners were women. The 2019 election finished the job. 7 more Republican seats flipped, 2 more women elected, and suddenly, for the first time in 2 decades, Democrats were in control of both houses of the state legislature, plus a Democratic governor. And what's even more amazing, with 41 women in the legislature, women had every single leadership position in the state legislature. President pro tem of the Senate, Majority Leader of the House of Delegates, and for the first time in 401 years, a woman was Speaker of the House of Delegates in the home of Thomas Jefferson. She was Eileen Fillicorn, a 55-year-old mother of 2 grown children, a veteran of 5 terms in the legislature, and a former aide to 2 former Democratic governors in the state. Fillicorn is known as an activist, a doer, ambitious, energetic, smart, savvy, and willing to come down off the dais and rally her own troops or even do the unprecedented walk across the state capitol to negotiate with the opposition in the state Senate to get a budget passed. When they came into power, Fillicorn and the Democratic majority were riding a tide of pent-up demand for reform from Virginia voters on all kinds of issues across the board. Gun safety was a big one, women's rights, ERA, higher state minimum wage, but nothing was more important than a package of voting right reforms. Now, most states do reform step by step. Do one year, do another one the next year. Not in Virginia, not with Fillicorn driving the bus. She pushed the whole package through in one time. They passed automatic voter registration when you renew your driver's license and contact certain state agencies. Same-day registration on Election Day. You can register when you go to cast your ballot. Changing the rules for absentee ballot, no excuse needed. Anyone can get it. Protection of minority rights, and maybe most important, getting rid of the controversial photo ID law that courts had said discriminated against minority voters and sometimes university students. It was an ambitious package. It was an impressive achievement. It broke with the past in Richmond. It broke with what other southern states have been struggling with, states like Alabama or Texas or North Carolina. In fact, take a look at the story in North Carolina. The battle rages on. It's fascinating.
Good evening, everybody. I am Rosa Nell Eaton, 92 years old. I am before you today to speak on voting rights.
7 decades ago, under Jim Crow, they made Rosa Nell Eaton recite the preamble of the U.S. Constitution to qualify to vote.
Without missing a word, I did it.
Now she's in a new war, fighting against a strict voter photo ID law, a powder keg issue in many states.
I am fed up and fired up. I said fed up, fired up. Thank you so much.
Yeah, y'all better say what Mama said. Fed up.
This is Moral Monday, a grassroots movement organized by the Reverend William Barber, an echo of the civil rights movement that won black voting rights back in the 1960s. Tensions are at fever pitch. Demonstrators occupy the state capitol, trying to stop passage of a new law that threatens black voting rights. and they get arrested by the busload. But Republicans who control state government pour on more restrictions.
Simply bring your North Carolina driver's license or identification card.
We've got a good bill. We've got a bill that ensures integrity of the voting place. It increases voter turnout, and it increases voter integrity.
If we look at this bill in its totality, it's all about suppressing the vote.
You see those children up there? Those children have been there for the last 3 hours with tapes around their mouths because they understand what this bill has the potential to do, which is take their voice away. This is a matter that I'm sure many of you are
Republican supermajorities steamroll passage, and in August 2013, Governor Pat McCrory signs the tough new voting law.
The integrity of our election process is vital to our democracy, which is why I've signed today several common-sense reforms into law, including voter ID.
It was not a photo ID. It was a monster, mean-spirited, manipulative, very cynical voter suppression bill, the likes of which we had not seen since Jim Crow.
Absolutely a backlash from the white Republican majority in the state legislature against what we had seen black voting strength do in previous elections.
I need you, North Carolina.
In 2008, black voters ensured that Barack Obama won North Carolina in that presidential election. Their political power was increasing.
The NAACP filed suit, and Allison Riggs, an attorney for the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, argued their case in court, contending that the photo ID law was unconstitutional.
We put on extensive evidence about each provision of the bill and how it would disproportionately impact voters of color. And we put on evidence that the legislature knew about those disproportionate impacts as they designed the bill. They changed the photo ID requirement to keep IDs that white voters most likely had and to get rid of the kind of IDs that black voters were more likely to have. And same thing with same-day registration, early voting, out-of-precinct voting, voting tools more likely to be used by voters of color.
Legislative leaders insisted they were fighting voter fraud. Was there something in the record which suggested to you all that there was a problem of voter fraud and that needed to be dealt with?
The opportunity to commit fraud was so easy, and it would have been foolish to assume that somebody at some point, even if they had not tried it in the past, would try it in the future.
During the trial, there was no evidence of voter fraud in North Carolina presented by the state.
Instead, evidence showed that 300,000 voters were suddenly disqualified because they lacked proper state ID.
And the requirements included a birth certificate, which automatically would disenfranchise a large number of African Americans who were born in segregation by midwives or at home where birth certificates were not issued.
Now, Rosanelle Eaton, 94 years old at the time, granddaughter of a slave, a voting rights activist back in the 1960s, ran into all kinds of problems, ran into a runaround. Do you remember any of her testimony, the gist of her testimony?
Rosanelle Eaton testified at trial that it took her roughly almost a month to go through all of the hurdles necessary to change documents that had incorrectly spelled her name.
A district judge upheld the photo ID law. Then in July 2016, a 3-judge appeals court struck it down as unconstitutional, declaring that the law's provisions target African Americans with almost surgical precision for partisan Republican advantage.
What happened was they backed off.
For Moral Monday, it was a decisive victory.
Forward together.
Not one step back.
Even so, the reform movement faced restricted access to early voting by Republican-controlled county election boards.
Many of the counties chose not to have Sunday voting. They chose not to have more than one site.
Stand up, fight back.
Protesters appealed to the State Board of Elections. Big cities got more polling sites. Some areas got Sunday voting for souls to the polls, marching straight from Sunday services to polling sites. But in 2018, Republican leaders got North Carolina voters to pass photo ID as a constitutional amendment, with the legislature once again to write the details.
I put nothing past this legislature. History is against them, and they just can't seem to come on into the 21st century. We will never stop battling. And when we're willing to put our bodies on the line, when we're willing to dust off the Constitution and go into the courts, we can win.